All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCTE on Air. I'm happy tonight to have you join us to talk about NCTE's Assessment Story Project with our guests Scott Filkins and Peggy O'Neill. During this chat, you can participate in a number of ways. I would invite you to enter questions in the Q&A. You can find that on your screens up in the corner. When you're watching this live, you'll see something that looks like a little grid. And when you click on that, it'll give you a choice between the Q&A or the showcase. If you click on the Q&A, you can enter your questions and we'll be able to see them on our end and try to answer them during this conversation. You can also participate by tweeting to hashtag NCTE on air, and we'll be checking that feed throughout this discussion. Also, if you look in the showcase feature, that's also something you can find from that grid at the top. When you look on that, there will be a link there to the survey that we'll actually be talking about this whole time, which is the Assessment Story Project Survey. We've been doing this project since February to collect stories from educators across the country, asking them to tell us about their experiences with assessment. And tonight, just like we did in the beginning of March, our guest will be talking a little bit about what we're learning from those stories that folks have been sharing with us for the past couple of months. Today, we're going to focus in particular at the beginning on one of the questions that we asked that was about the role families and community members play in assessment, both in terms of being informed and in terms of decision making on the local level. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guests. Peggy O'Neill is the Professor of Writing and Department Chair at Loyola University in Maryland. And Scott Filkins is an educator in the Champaign Unit 4 schools and a facilitator for NCTE. So I'd like both of you to start by sharing with us what you have found most intriguing about this story project so far.
So I'll get started. For me, as a college professor, I think what's been most interesting is to kind of see what's happening on the ground in K-12, the kind of experiences that my students are having before they get to my classroom. I can see what they bring with them from my point of view, but it's interesting to hear from the teachers what's happening, and that what I'm seeing is a wide range, and I think that it just depends what kind of school district they have, what state they're in, what their mandates are. But just getting a sense from the teachers across the country has been really helpful for me, especially because I teach first-year students every fall.
Great.
Yeah, so building on what Peggy said, as being someone in a K-12 public school, I was surprised at how diverse the responses about standardized assessment itself are. So if we're seeing a broad diversity of responses across a lot of topics, I was really surprised how much diversity there was in the way people are thinking about standardized assessment. And a couple things I noticed were how people made the distinction between whether or not a standardized assessment gave you information at the system level versus an individual student level. People are also thinking about the different ways that information is reported. Sometimes the information is good but comes too late. And definitely the conversation is shifting as the consequences associated with assessment are changing, particularly with teacher evaluation entering the mix. So I totally agree that with Peggy that local context is making such a difference. I was just surprised to see how much diversity there was in standardized assessment. Not that a whole lot of teachers were saying, you know, yay, go for it, but it's a lot more complicated and nuanced of a conversation than I maybe even expected. So that, to me, is a really cool thing about this project.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that a lot of what's been intriguing to all of us who are part of this project, and this project was started by NCTE's executive committee. They identified a group of members that they wanted to start a task force to look at issues in assessment and think about what NCTE and its members could be doing to talk about that publicly. And I think what's been fascinating to all of us is, like Peggy and Scott said, the diversity of answers that we're getting there, but also how different they are from what we see, particularly in the public, in the media, talking about assessment. And so that's why we wanted tonight to talk about one of the questions in particular, question number 3. Question number 3 that we asked on the survey is, how might families and other community members be informed about assessment and involved in decision making around assessment? And I'd love for Scott to talk a little bit about why we chose that question in the first place, and then we'll share with you some of the things that we're finding in the answers.
Sure. So I think one of the reasons why we decided to ask it is in the NCTE IRA assessment standards, there are two at the end, 9 and 10, that specifically call out the need for multiple stakeholders to be involved in assessment. And that really comes from that standards document thinking of assessment as not something separate from teaching and learning, but something integral to it. So just as I think generally we think it's a good idea for family members to have some input and understanding of what kids are being taught, it makes sense for them to have some input and understanding into what's being assessed and what we're doing with it. So I think part of the reason just comes from the fact that our professional organizations think it's a good idea for family members to have some stake in assessment, just like we want them to have stake in every other part of a child's education.
Just to follow up with that from Scott, I don't think it's just the professional organizations making that assertion. That's what the research shows, that to make it more valuable in terms of learning, that there needs to be an investment by the learner and the community, the stakeholders, and at all levels. And that is more than just that they will receive the consequences of the assessment, whether it's a standardized high-stakes assessment or a more classroom-based one, but that they're actually involved in decision-making about it. Like they understand why it's happening, and they get a say in it. And so I think that that's another reason that research shows over time that really does make a difference, so people don't feel like it's just something external. And at the college level, in our writing assessment position statement, we follow that same principle, saying that best practice is to include the stakeholders and to include them at all levels, from the students all the way up through the community. So I think that that's a really good reason to be asking this kind of question.
Right, and so I'm going to share a couple of the things that we're noticing in trends from the responses to that, and then Peggy and Scott, if you would talk a little bit about how you're seeing that play out in these responses, or add some of your thoughts to these overall observations. And there's kind of 4 general categories that the responses seem to fall into, and these are responses, again, from kindergarten through college. So maybe, Peggy, in a moment, you could talk a little bit about what the span looks like in terms of responses. But we're getting a significant chunk of feedback from each grade band, from K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12, and then college. And one of the kinds of comments that we're getting back on this are that some educators just don't think there's really a place for the outside community in decision making around assessment. They feel like that's the responsibility of the educators within the building, and it should probably rest with those who work in the school.
So I'll start with that. I think what's interesting is when I saw those responses, which I think, and I haven't done a count, but I think that's in the minority, that kind of response where we don't want, leave us alone. As one respondent said, educators are the experts, right? They're the ones with the degrees, the ones that have studied, and they need to be making these decisions. I think that kind of response is really in the minority, but I think it kind of comes out of this, or the way I'm reading is, it comes out of a sense of frustration because everyone's telling teachers what to do and not respecting their expertise and their experience. So I do think that sometimes teachers can feel like there's too many people telling them what to do that don't have the expertise, and they're not valuing that. So I think that's one of the reasons that we see that. And we hear that in the, the discussions now, the public discussions, all about what should we be doing, what testing, how much testing, but it's not really the teachers making those decisions. It's people that are the policymakers, the pundits, the public. So I do think that a lot of that frustration, that is how I'm reading that, those comments. But most of the comments really seem to be about wanting more involvement with the community. And some teachers had really great ways to talk about it, and others just don't know how they can do it. So I thought that was interesting too, that for many, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Scott, because I think your experience fits into that category of
I definitely will share some of those things, but I wanted to add to your comments about the frustration. I wonder too if people who are expressing that frustration are working in contexts where assessment and accountability are really tightly linked, and there's not as much conversation about assessment as a tool for learning. I feel like that frustration comes when assessment is associated with like fear and consequences, and there's a desire to kind of control what's going on, and there's less openness if the conversation isn't about assessment as part of the like actual teaching and learning process.
Right, so that divide between the high stakes accountability kinds of assessment and then the more integral kinds of assessment that are part of just teaching and learning. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that we tend to think of it as only the formal kind, or I think that's how a lot of people are interpreting it, since that's where so much pressure is put on us.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the cool things that we're going to see in the responses is because the questions didn't necessarily ask what kind of assessment to think and talk about, we're going to see how the individual context plays out in the responses.
Yeah, and Scott and I were talking about this as well earlier about we wondered if there was any kind of connection between the community in terms of the socioeconomic status of the community and the response of the teachers. So the one response that I mentioned before is from a high-achieving suburban high school. So I can imagine in that situation where there might be too many parents and coming to the teachers and saying, why isn't, my child needs to get this grade so they can get into this college, or why aren't they, they need this grade so they can get into the gifted and talented program. So that could be a factor as well. We haven't really looked at it that way, but it is interesting to see how the local is influencing how teachers respond to that question.
Yeah, and as when we start finding more examples of local contexts that really do have rich and open conversations about assessment, it'll be interesting to see the degree to which they are like accountability-driven districts or actual kid achievement driven.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was it was interesting because that was another kind of responses that we saw. There were some schools that were putting together pretty detailed programs and communication efforts to keep parents aware of what's happening around assessment, but that was very focused, like you were saying, Scott. There's a variety here, but those examples tended to be very focused on standardized tests in particular, and these were responses we saw especially in sort of the K-12 realm. And there were a couple of examples where they would be providing, evening sessions where they were talking about test preparation or things like that. So I guess that kind of goes back to your point of showing that there's a lot of variability that's happening on the local level.
Mm-hmm.
There was another category, though, that I think was the largest category, and Peggy alluded to this earlier, which is these responses that said essentially, yeah, community involvement. I've heard the research. I'm aware that it's something that should be happening, but I don't know how to do that. There were some people who I feel like they, in those exact words, said, I wish I knew how to do that. I wish our school could think about a way to make that happen. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, particularly in light of the context that Peggy gave us at the beginning of there being a lot of studies that talk about the importance of community engagement in these kinds of important conversations and decisions around things like assessment. What does that mean that we're hearing from a number of respondents who are saying, well, how do I do that?
Well, I think, again, like we've been saying over and over, it's so local. Like I remember the one story where the teacher said, our school has we have a committee of parents that are involved, and they represent the all the other parents, kind of like a PTA type thing, but it was just about the assessment and testing. And so that seemed like a great model. Another teacher said maybe we could form a committee, so they're starting to think, but I think that in many places the teachers and the schools are butting up against these requirements, and with the standardized tests, and that it's hard, there isn't a lot of room for community engagement in those kinds of top-down, externally mandated formal tests. So that's what people are thinking, and it takes so many resources that they don't have for a lot of teachers and communities, they don't have the time to put into the other kinds of assessment. And what do you think, Scott, since you're more on the ground?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about a couple things. One being the need for just a conversation about what assessment means first, right? So I feel like before you start engaging the larger public, there needs to be some sort of clear internal sense of why we're assessing. But I'm also thinking it makes sense to think about what are the decisions to be made, even if some of them aren't within our control, right? So you might not be able to decide how or what tests are given, but local communities do have some say in how the information is communicated and used and what can potentially happen to a student because of the assessment. So I think it would make sense just to kind of open up the sense of what decisions do still rest within local control. Because I think there is kind of a sense that like we've been taken over, but that giving up of agency is a really dangerous thing to do, and the standards definitely make it clear that teachers need to reclaim, agency as assessors. So in those moments when we're thinking, all the decisions have been made, I think we're kind of missing some really important opportunities to clarify what decisions do still exist. So I would hope that that's the kind of work that those committees kind of engage in. Admittedly, it's not the kind of thing that our district is doing right now, but it does make me think about the kinds of things, the kind of conversations that families do get involved in. And I know when we shifted to standards-based grading with a couple of grades in our high school a few years ago, we had a lot of difficulty kind of focusing the conversation on why we're doing things and the philosophy of assessment when people were much more interested in hearing about the different processes and procedures, which to me just made it clear that a lot of people come to assessment as like a technical process and maybe have a little bit more difficulty engaging in the conversation about what the thinking is behind those processes.
I think just following up from that one of the other things that happens that I've noticed in this in the responses we've gotten to this survey, and Baltimore is an example of this, even within a local area, there can be such a wide range. So when we think local, it really is school and district. The Baltimore Sun just had an article in about how much testing is happening in the Baltimore area. So it looked at, I think it was 5 or 6 districts that are Baltimore City and the counties surrounding it. And they looked at 8th grade, which is the most tested grade, and there was, for standardized testing, the number of hours ranged from 14 in one district to 46 in another district, which that's huge. And so I think of those districts with 46 hours of standardized testing in one grade to even find the time to talk about other kinds of assessment, more formative or classroom-based, or they're just like trying to process, as Scott said, like what are the procedures? Which test is it now? How do we, what does this mean? And how for teachers to even process that or parents to process all that data seems overwhelming for 46 hours for 1 year. That's just, I was overwhelmed by that myself. 14 hours seemed more reasonable.
Yeah, and when I hear that just points out to me how many decisions there are to be made at a local level, because someone is making the decision to do more testing in one district than another, right? So what are the ways that we could get more people involved in that process? Because clearly there is that the choice is being made by someone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that also emerged from responses to this particular question were examples of places where the community actually is pretty involved in looking at student work. And in particular, I saw a couple of examples where that was emerging around portfolios and places where the community could actually be brought in to give feedback on portfolios, or one place where I think they actually had some student work showing as trailers before movies in a local movie theater. So I feel like that there was also some really, even though by and large we heard a lot of frustration or questions about how to do this, there were also a fair number of examples that I thought offered some hope and some examples of how that might be possible.
Yeah, I thought some of those were really exciting. The brief PowerPoint displays that they showed at the local movie theaters seemed so innovative and not very labor intensive if you could get local theaters to buy into it. That seemed interesting. And then I think we saw this at the college level, but also at the high school level, the showcase of writing where they have the students put, like a fair, showcase what they're doing, and then invite community members and business people into the school to kind of see it. It's kind of like the science fair model, but not for science projects, but for writing. So I thought and I know on college level, a lot of people do that in their first year writing programs where they call it the showcase of writing, and they do it more on campus. They sometimes invite community members to come in and look at student work, and students, showcase what they've been working on in that semester, and they have prizes and stuff. So that seems like a great way to actually get feedback in a more positive way and more of a formative kind of, and for writing and reading, those kinds of activities, students get excited about doing that. Like I can imagine students getting really excited about, having something shown before a movie. That would be great.
Yeah, and I think that that all of that kind of points to the fact that if there are ways that you can involve the community more in conversations around or experiences around assessment, then assessment ceases to be such a dirty word. And I think that Scott, you referenced this earlier on, that assessment is actually a fundamental, core, critical part of good instruction, but particularly in what we're seeing, particularly over the past couple months in the media, and with the huge backlash against some of the Common Core tests that are happening right now, and people opting out, and parents being very vocal about their frustration. A lot of it, I think, points to what you're talking about, Peggy, in terms of the amount of time that's being taken away from instruction. So they get the connection on a sort of level there, that like instruction is good, taking time away from it is not good, but then the assessment becomes the bad guy in this story. And so, and I feel like, Peggy, some of the comments that you shared in looking at these stories point to the fact that maybe we're actually sort of looking at some of the wrong questions here by focusing our conversation just on standardized tests. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you've noted an interesting relationship between teachers' stories about assessments that are designed to measure if students are college and career ready, and how ready college educators are finding these students to be when they arrive. So if you could talk a little bit about what you've observed there.
Well, I think that's a pretty clear divide. I mean, those findings seem pretty strong, that many of the college people that are responding are saying that the current, and I would say last 10, 12 years, that focus on testing has really been detrimental to students' preparation for college, that they really aren't ready. And this is one of the dangers of poorly designed assessments that have high stakes attached. I mean, when students think that they're good writers because they've done well on a test, and then they get to college and they're not at all prepared because that test model of writing doesn't work anymore. And I see it every fall with students. We have most of the students that come to Loyola are very high performing. We're considered a highly selective school, and yet our students come and many of them struggle in the first year writing class because they're not used to writing things that are longer than what they can do in a timed situation. So how do you develop an idea past your initial thoughts in 20 minutes? And then, so when you have to take something and really dive into it, understand it, really do revision, like reimagine, rethink something, and work on one topic over time, they really struggle with just that process because they don't know how to get past that surface. and they've been rewarded for that. It's not their fault. That's what they've been rewarded for. So that I see that, and from my peers in this survey and in other venues, people are seeing that as well. It's it's almost kind of we made a lot of progress in terms of writing process and all thinking about audience purpose, genre, and then we get to this. The last decade of testing has kind of undermined that whole movement, and I actually worry about teachers now who have been teaching for the last 10 years. Do they even know how to teach that kind of writing?
Mm-hmm.
And the assessment is a huge part of it, because you're evaluating students through the process, giving them feedback so they can improve their drafts and become better writers. So that assessment, as Scott was saying, that formative assessment is just so critical to them developing into effective writers. And I think that's been missing a lot.
If you were able to wave a magic wand to start chipping away at that observed problem, it sounds like in what I'm hearing that you're saying that some of the building blocks are there. We've got some ideas about what's necessary to prepare students to be good writers, or what good writing looks like. What are some ways that you think that we could create a shift in that?
Well, I think what's happened with writing is it's become just a way to show what you know,
mm-hmm.
and not as something that actually helps you understand and learn what it is. So trying to rethink how we approach writing, so it's not just something to test to show what we know. Having students do authentic kinds of writing. I mean, none of this is new. The National Writing Project and NCTE and the research in writing pedagogy have been talking about this for the last 30 years or more. So we have that base, but it's just kind of atrophied in the last decade or so. And so I think we need to rejuvenate that. And the National Writing Project has always been really one of those places that it's helped, and it's demonstrated that that kind of professional development or professional learning through the National Writing Project is really effective. So trying to have professional learning opportunities that actually get at teaching and formative kinds of assessment instead of getting them to, get a higher score on the state test, or even get a higher score on their AP exam, So I think we have the knowledge in our field. We just aren't. The teachers in the classroom haven't been able to use it. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about. I totally agree with the need for professional development that supports this, but I'm worried by the fact that districts sometimes find themselves in this kind of catch-22, where you're happy that an assessment includes writing, because if it doesn't, a lot of times it gets forced out of the curriculum. But if an assessment does include writing, that becomes the vision of writing for the kids' experience. So it feels like there does need to be a shift at the policy and assessment level if that's going to continue to kind of drive the way a classroom works. Teachers affiliated with the National Writing Project need to stop feeling like they're doing something wrong, by teaching the way that they teach. And I feel like a lot of times that's what our teachers end up saying, that I have to do this, but kind of like in secret, because they know their real goal is to prepare them for, assessment X. So I think going back to that comment at the beginning of the talk, if we don't see assessment, teaching, learning, and PD all as the same really deeply entwined big idea, any shifts in one is not going to be as powerful as you'd hope.
Yeah, and I think one of those divides that we see between college and K-12 is that at the college level there is a lot more autonomy. Mm-hmm. Even in state institutions that, some states are more restrictive or have more requirements, you have to use this placement method, but in the classroom and in programs, the faculty are able to develop even program-wide assessments that fit with their learning goals for that program. And I don't think a lot of the K-12 teachers have that kind of autonomy where they can actually develop things for their students that can showcase what they know and are able to do, and that could go on with them to college. You know, we saw, I think the biggest portfolios is probably the biggest single type of alternative, I'm calling it, assessment to that kind of standardized high stakes. And they've been around for a long time. And some of the teachers are telling us that they can't even do the portfolios in the ways they want to because of these other kinds of demands. So at the college level, I think the portfolio is probably, let me just say, it's helpful when students have had that kind of experience and they come to college. They understand the idea of revision better. They get to see not a piece of writing in isolation. So all of those things that doesn't happen in that kind of standardized model, where it's just a test, I write it, it's scored, I'm done, and they actually can use it and revise it and try it out on real audiences. And I think that would be a great place for us to try to kind of do what Scott said, kind of get everything aligned, the professional development, the assessment, and the teaching and learning.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that I felt strongly in looking through these responses. Is I so wish that I could go in there and bring all these people together and put all 350 folks in the same room together and say, just talk for a couple of hours, and then whatever would emerge from that conversation would probably be an answer to a lot of these problems. So facilitating that conversation is actually something that I think will be an end goal of this project. We're hoping to take the findings from it and turn it into some reports and some stories we can share, but also at some upcoming gatherings that NCTE has to have some opportunities to share these conversations publicly and facilitate some conversation amongst people in the room who are looking at what folks are saying. Scott, I know that you've also looked through there to find some examples of some strong assessment practices that you've noted in these stories. We've talked to date a lot about about a lot of the realities that are being experienced from some of the big tests. But I was wondering if you could share some of the assessment practices that you've noticed in here that aren't necessarily tied to standardized assessments.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I was really pleased to find is how many teachers are really strong at understanding that a lot of times the things that you need to look for in a formative sense to really know what you need to teach next could never appear on a standardized test, right? So one example that I really loved, a middle school teacher said, my first assessment comes when I greet students each day. What is their mood? Are they tired? And I think that just reminds us that assessment is a very human process. It's about one person trying to make some sort of understanding or judgment about another human. And I just like the way she pointed out that that kind of thing matters. She went on to say that she does look at written work to try to understand what kids understand and what they don't, but that's less important to her than ongoing assessment of who they're becoming as learners. So if we think about the things Peggy was saying about writers who understand what revision is and what really discussion with an audience or multiple audiences looks like, those are about the kid as a learner rather than a producer of text. And I think that's where we have so much conflict in trying to teach differently, because tests see kids differently from the way we do, right? So I really enjoyed responses like that. A lot of teachers were just talking about the way they use writing or talk, and talk being a thing that a standardized test can never get at. The in-the-moment conversations that a teacher gets to hear and make notes about and do something with. One teacher said during a Socratic seminar she listens and tracks the conversations, assessing exchanges of ideas. After the seminar, then they write a reflection. So the connectedness between the different literate practices, that speech and writing aren't actually separate, something that a test can't get at. I was just really heartened by the number of responses like that, where teachers were saying, I know this is what works for me. It doesn't look like what a standardized assessment looks like, but it's what I do. Something that Peggy and I were talking about before we went on air was the degree to which these are individual teachers engaged in really strong practice, or if these are things that are more grade level wide or building wide. We wonder the extent to which these things are capacities of systems, or just teachers who are really effective at paying attention to kids and doing what you need to do to get them to the next step.
One of the things that has made me think a lot about assessment is all the press that we've gotten in the last few years about Finland schools, you know, and how great they are. And what's so interesting to me about that is that the whole system works differently. So we want to compare ourselves to Finland, and yet we don't want to have a system like that, and where teachers are considered professionals, and it's a highly selective field, and they are given the autonomy in the school and the classroom to do what is needed to help that student learn. And they do have a test, but it's not every year, and it doesn't have the same, they're not obsessing over the results of it. Where we've kind of, the idea of the assessments are to kind of help us get a gauge on where students are. And there's some good reasons why we have these accountability tests, because of our history of racism and segregation and unequal opportunities in education. So I understand that impetus for it, but I don't think focusing on the test is the way that it's going to happen. And I think the teachers that Scott was referencing, they understand that too. It's not, you have to actually take care of the kids that are in your classroom right there, whether it's in kindergarten or in college. The focus has to be on helping those individuals to achieve and to learn and to do all of those things that help them to progress in their own educational journey, not just to get a score on a standardized test. So I think that part of it is what's been missing in that, this kind of, and I think the teachers are saying it in different ways across the levels from kindergarten up through college.
Yeah, I wondered, Peggy, you and I a while ago had talked a little bit about what some of these practices look like at your school. I remember you telling me about a course that kind of integrated life experiences outside of a classroom with the learning that they were doing on the campus. But I was wondering, you could either speak to something like that, or if there are things that you've noticed, particularly in looking at the college level responses, that reflect strong assessment practices, or ones that kind of stood out to you as things that we should look closer at and think about if there's a way to sort of scale those or take them to other places.
So in college, because it's the system is different, we do in our institution as a whole, but in my department as well, we do a lot of service learning where students are writing with and for and about the community. So in those kinds of classes, students it's usually project based. So they're maybe they're doing a grant proposal for a nonprofit. So they have to learn about the nonprofit. They have to find potential sources for funding, write the grant. I usually have them present that to a panel of people from that nonprofit, and they give them feedback. Or they might be, we have students that design web pages for a community organization, and then they maintain it for one of the neighborhood associations. So they're doing projects that are very much grounded in what the learning in the class is supposed to be, but they're involving the community, and they have real audience members that they have to talk to them and find out what the goals are of the web page or newsletters. We have students that classes. One of our first year classes writes a newsletter that is distributed to the incoming class during orientation. So they write it and they finalize it at the end of their first year, and then it goes to the incoming class of the new first year students. So they kind of get to share their expertise from, what do I wish I would have known when I started college. And that's one of the ways that we try to use writing in ways that they can see how it's connected to the world beyond the classroom. Internships are another way. And while some of these things might not translate directly to K-12, I know in high schools there are lots of opportunities to do those kinds of programs. And since the focus now with the Common Core standards is college and career ready, you would think that there would be a way to involve more of that. So having college professors, instructors, students working more with the high school, giving feedback. I did a program, and this was in 1996, I think, where I was at University of Louisville, and I was having my students, my first-year students, respond to high school students' essays as if they were in their own classroom as a peer group, saying, what would they have to do to make this a college-level paper? So there are ways to do those things. I just think that a lot of K-12 teachers now, they're doing some amazing things, but it's almost like you really have to be amazing and go way above and beyond to be able to meet the demands of, for example, in one of the counties around Baltimore, 46 hours of testing and doing these innovative projects. And I think the new Common Core curriculum has also created a big workload for teachers. That's what I hear from my colleagues that are involved in K-12, either in the College of Ed or in classrooms, that there's been this huge new workload for teachers depending on what their school district's curriculum was to start with. They might be doing a lot of work just to try to infuse that Common Core into their classrooms. So I think there's so many moving parts right now that it's really hard for teachers to do some of those innovative things.
There are, and I think we see that challenge and both the aspirations and the challenges reflected in these responses. But we're also on the cusp of all sorts of possible changes. I'm located here in DC, and I know that the Senate just came out with their version of a new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and we were thrilled to see that literacy actually featured prominently in a number of places in there, and the importance of having comprehensive literacy programs, but also some conversation, not as much as we would like, but some conversation about the importance of supporting the growth and development of effective formative assessment practices within schools. So here's another visionary, look into a crystal ball, but also be aspirational moment. If we move forward with assessments as a country and in our individual locales over the next 10 years, what trends would you hope to see in survey responses were we to do this same project, the Assessment Story Project, again in 2025?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Peg.
No, you can go. I'm thinking.
Yeah. I would just hope that we could more uniformly see that teachers and the systems in which they work aren't seeing assessment and teaching and learning as separate activities. It feels like right now that's an overwhelming undercurrent, if not a directly stated aspect of these responses. There's a discussion of, here's the thing that I do in order to do the assessment that comes from the outside. Here's what I do to keep my classroom world functioning as a place where teaching and learning happen. I would like to see just more across the board assessment, teaching, and learning being things that are talked about in the same breath and being, inextricable from one another.
I would actually like to see less emphasis on the standardized testing, kind of like what Scott's saying, and more about just how education as an authentic experience, like helping students and teachers connect. I would like to see more of what we were just talking about, where there's more authentic connections between what's happening in the schools and what's happening in the communities, and more involvement of all the stakeholders, not just in the assessment, formal assessments, but in the process of education, which that means in the assessments, both informal and formal, but just so that education is seen not just as getting you ready for college or career, but part of what it means to be a citizen in this country, and how to participate the community in which you live, whether that's just your local community or your city or your state or the nation. So I see that as missing in a lot of this, where I think that used to be a big part of education, was, being an educated person, not just so you could go to a job or go to college.
Great. Well, that about wraps up our conversation today. And let me just say to those who are tuning in right now or tune in the future, if these beautiful realities happen, it will be thanks in no small part to some of the thinking of my guests tonight. So thank you, Scott Filkins, and thank you, Peggy O'Neill, for sharing your thoughts on the Assessment Story Project. You can watch a recording of this video as soon as we sign off. It'll be available forever on YouTube and also on our Google page. Yay. And also please share your stories if you haven't done so already through the Assessment Story Project survey. You can find it on our blog. That's blogs.ncte.org. And you can also find the link to that survey along the right-hand side of this video. It'll be one of the items that's available there. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month. And happy birthday to Scott, who joined us tonight on his birthday.
Happy birthday.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks.